This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. In this week's video, I want to talk about the 5 worst limited formats in the Arena era. In other words, sets that have come out since Magic Arena was a thing, and it came out, Arena that is, back in 2018. I have talked about some older bad sets on this channel, bad sets for limited, obviously is what we're talking about here, such as a video I did about Cold Snap, which I think might just be the worst limited format of all time, at least once they started designing for limited. You can check that video out if you want to hear about a pre-Arena set, but in this video I'll be talking about 5 and then actually sort of a 6th honorable mention set, all of which I think were not good. I do think the top 4 are actual bad sets, and the other 2, are problematic, but maybe not bad. But I wanted to get to 5 here, and plus an honorable mention. So that's where we are. So let me just dive in, start talking about these bad sets, what made them bad, and so forth. So the honorable mention I want to talk about is the Throne of Eldraine bot draft. So originally, when Limited started on Arena, you could only do bot drafts. And for that reason, I didn't play that much Arena in those days. I was sticking to Magic Online, where you could still draft in pods, and that's still how I prefer to play. Eventually, they did add pod drafts to Arena, so, that's why I don't play Magic Online a whole lot anymore. But back in those pod draft days, if you did one during the Throne of Eldraine, or not pod draft, but bot draft days, if you did one for Throne of Eldraine, there was like a month where it was like the worst, maybe the worst limited format ever, because, they hadn't really gotten used to, using data about limited to inform the AI how to draft well. And basically what happened was if you found out in these early days of bot drafts what they weren't drafting and what they were undervaluing, everyone just pretty much drafted the same deck. And for Eldraine, it was the worst of all of these, and it was the mill deck. You could get like 7 copies of Merfolk Secret Keeper, and it was just like 50% of what you played was mill mirrors, and the rest of what you played was people who hadn't realized that mill was always open. And this wasn't like that real of a deck in actual Eldraine Limited, but it was in bot drafts, and it was a miserable format. The reason I have it as an honorable mention, and even though I just said maybe it's the worst limited format of all time, is because it's not Throne of Eldraine as the whole. In fact, that's a very good limited format. It's just these bot drafts that were awful. And once they fixed that, once we could do Throne of Eldraine pod drafts, once the AI got better for quick drafts, Eldraine was a good format. So it was sort of a short-lived, awful format. So at number 5, like I said, this set I don't think is nearly as bad as the others. The other 4, all pretty bad. This one, is not as good as the others, and that's how it ends up here. And that is Corset 2019. So, we don't have Corsets anymore exactly. But generally, they tend to have kind of mediocre limited formats. This was especially true before they started adding new cards and, constructing core sets, at least with limited sort of in mind. So this is better than a lot of old core sets, but in terms of the Arena era, this is the worst of these core sets. And what's wrong with it, really, is just that it's not interesting. I mean, it's just, Corset 2019 was basically just like, draft a good curve, draft some removal spells, and build a deck. And, in terms of what core sets are intended for, which is sort of helping people understand Magic in a lot of ways, an easy on-ramp for people, that in terms of doing that, it was good. But if you were like a seasoned limited player, this format was thoroughly uninteresting. They tried to seed some archetypes in here, and some of them worked, but most of them were just like aggressive ones. There were 4 archetypes in the format that I think were just complete duds that basically never came together. And if you tried to make it work, you would just lose to the other decks. And those were green-white enchantments, blue-black control, red-green ramp, and black-red sacrifice. Most limited formats have like 1 color pair that's undersupported. This one had 4. And in addition to that, a lot of the decks and gameplay felt very samey. And so I didn't love it. But like I said, it's not as messed up or broken or unbalanced as the top 4 cards on this list. Its primary sin is just that it was uninteresting, less so than anything else. So that's number 5, Corset 2019. Number 4, I have Aquaria, Lair of Behemoths. I think this one's kind of controversial. I've talked about it a little bit before on stream or whatever, and people have been surprised. And this is another one, sort of like the Eldraine bot drafts, that if you play Aquaria now, it's not as bad. Things have changed. And that thing that has changed mostly is that companions have been nerfed. So in original Aquaria, which is most of what I ever played of Aquaria, like the first 2 or 3 months it existed, the companions were not nerfed. And what I mean by this is originally, before they fixed them somewhat, they still had to be banned even after being fixed in some formats. So, but anyway, companion was messed up mechanic. And originally, you could just basically start with one of these in a command zone of sorts, if you met the deck building requirement. And if you did, you could just cast it from there. So you got an 8th card in your opening hand, and it was usually synergistic with everything else you did. Now, it was really interesting, like at first, this was really interesting because basically everybody who does limited reviews and stuff, including myself, was like, playing these companions in your main deck, a lot of them are just good cards anyway. I don't think it's going to be worth like making your deck do crazy things like have only odd or even cards or cards that cost 3 or more mana. It's not going to be worth doing that, right? To play these companions. Well, turned out it was, and not only was it, basically, if you didn't get a companion in this limited format for those few months, you were going to have a pretty hard time getting to like 5 wins. And so there were a few other strategies that worked. There was also a completely busted cycling deck, which was also a problem. So we've got 2 big balance problems here. Companion decks, way better than everything else. Cycling decks, way better than everything else. So those were kind of the things you had to do to consistently have a high win percentage. And that got uninteresting fast. There were also, probably the most interesting thing in the format were the ultimatum decks, because the mana was good enough. You could draft and build around an ultimatum, and this was powerful enough to beat companions in the cycling decks, and that was cool. But meanwhile, the cycling and companion decks were all just completely busted, and it made the format really bad, in my opinion. Every time I talk about this, I have people in the comments who are like, no, companions weren't worth it. And I just don't know what limited format they were playing. And it's true, not all of them are. Like, you can't make Zerta work in limited. That one's bad. There are a few bad ones in the set. And none of them are actually bad. Like, that's still a good main deck card. But there are a few of them that aren't worth building around. But I think like 7 of them were, and they were all really good. Pre-nerf. Once they nerfed them, this fixed this problem in most ways. Now you have to pay 3 mana, add it to your hand, and then cast it. It gets put into your hand, which first of all means your opponent can make you discard it, which is a thing, but also it just means usually you have to wait like 2 full turns before you can cast your companion, and that makes a big difference. I do put it lower than I would if they had never nerfed companions, though. Like at number 4 here, I'm sort of giving it a little bit of credit for the format being somewhat fixed. Cycling deck's still broken, though, so that's kind of a problem. So at number 3, and this one doesn't come as a surprise, I have Streets of New Capena. This one's not surprising because of the ones we've talked about so far, this set has been out since the series started. The series has been around for a little over a year now. So I talked about this set a lot. There are a bunch of videos in this series about it already. But suffice it to say, the format was very unbalanced, making it uninteresting in a hurry. And people also came into the set with an expectation that it was going to be, a real 3-color set where you frequently play 3 colors, like you do in Khans of Tarkir or Alara. But in reality, this was mostly a 2-color set where you splash a 3rd color, and that already was like disappointing. But then it also turned out that the broker's colors, green, white, and blue, and then the green-white deck and the blue-white deck especially, were far and away better than everything else. There was a completely busted common in the set, an Inspiring Overseer, and, if every color has a completely busted common, maybe things would have been more balanced, but no one else really did. There was a pretty good one in green in Jewel Thief, but no one else could really match what this card was, which was a 2-for-1. And then the format was just incredibly aggressive. It had some of the best tricks we've ever seen. There was a lot of tempo that felt awful. Like, if you were playing against a good Broker's deck, they would just curve out, draw some extra cards, tap your things down, kill you. It was like, it didn't matter what you did, you were dead, and that was not very much fun. And even when you're on the playing end of that, sure, it's a little more fun because you're winning, but it gets repetitive fast. So the format lacked this sort of wedge deck, or I guess in this case, shard decks that people kind of wanted to be the thing in the format. And then it turned out it was a fast, assertive, aggressive format, which also isn't really what you expect from a 3-color set. And it was also unbalanced. And this made it a very unfun, limited format. And, this is coming from someone who drafted the set a bunch and reached top 350 or 250 or whatever, Mythic and stuff. Winning isn't enough. The set wasn't that much fun. It was one of the worst sets in the Arena era, 3rd worst, in fact. And number 2, I have Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. This is one I've talked about a little bit on this series before, when talking about formats that have a problem, like in general, and this one is one of those. So this set's interesting because it didn't look like a Corset. I already talked about how Corsets can be really uninteresting, but it kind of ended up playing like a Corset, and that already is like, okay, this isn't that interesting. But there were more problems than that. One of them was that one of the big shining mechanics from the set that we were all excited to play with, that was really innovative and neat, was the dungeons. But it turned out they really weren't that interesting. First of all, most of the cards that did dungeon things just weren't good. So that already, not so good. But also, the cool thing about it is you have these 3 choices between 3 different dungeons. And, that modality seemed really cool. And it would sort of, you would think it would sort of set you off in different directions depending on, what the board state is. But you almost always chose the small dungeon that had only positive effects. It only had like 3 levels, and then you got to draw a card at the end, as opposed to the really long dungeon that had all kinds of effects and then, had a bigger payoff. But the actual payoff you got from it really was about the same as just going through the shorter dungeon twice, which you could do in the same amount of time. So that wasn't designed well at all. The dungeons weren't designed well. You did have one that you used sometimes. Like if your opponent was really far behind, you could choose the one that was all negative, symmetrical negative effects. And that happened sometimes, but not enough. Like 95% of the time, you chose the short positive effect dungeon and didn't ever choose the others. So the way they were designed in the first place, not interesting, even though it looked like it would be. Then all of those dungeon archetypes were just bad and limited, which also didn't help. And then, things don't end there, blue was awful in this set. Just awful. So, sometimes people are hyperbolic, and they say X color is unplayable in a limited format. People, it's a hot take. Most formats, that's not true. There's always a worst color, but if that color is really open, you should probably draft it, right? Not true here. You almost had to entirely avoid blue. Like blue, and this was an era when we had 17 lands data and stuff too, and it was not good. I mean, that was very bad. Like the blue was just so much worse than everything else. So you had an entire color, that was bad. And that isn't good. And then you had an entire, 3 or 4 color pairs about dungeons that were bad. And that was just not a good total package. And on top of that, it was simple. The format was, the decks that were good weren't interesting. They were aggressive. The black-red sacrifice deck was the best, etc. I mean, it just wasn't a good format. I do think there's one that's even worse, though, and it's one that you may not even know released because, based on the set review I did for it, nobody watched it, and that is Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. This was an arena-only set, sort of. So, yeah, this format is they took the paper Commander Legends 2 Baldur's Gate set and ported it over to arena, kind of. The format... first of all, like the actual design of this whole thing looks like it was the laziest thing ever, and that's not a good place to start. You know, famously, this set just like reused a bunch of art from Baldur's Gate, the paper set for completely different cards, and things like that. They, you know, really were lazy about using art and reworking cards. And you had cards that were completely functionally different, but had the exact same art, which, sure, you're not going to ever be playing with paper Baldur's Gate cards with digital ones. But for a game that in the past, you know, has made an emphasis that you should be able to look at the art of a card and know what it is after you know what the card does. If you're playing both paper and arena, that's not going to happen here. That itself is a problem. They also, I think maybe the biggest misstep of them all were the 6-sided specialized cards in the set, which was kind of a cool mechanic. Like, you know, I think it's kind of a cool mechanic. You would have these creatures, they were all legendary, you'd play them, and then you would pay some cost and discard a card, and it would become a specialized card. It would flip, basically, into a multicolored or monocolored, if it was the same color, version that was better. And the color it became was based on the color of the land or the spell that you discarded. So it sounds kind of cool, but the problem was these cards had so many different modes on them that you had to keep track, and you had to keep, you know, if you want to do well, you have to keep track of all of these different modes because you don't know which one your opponent might use. And that is not elegant design at all. So it's kind of a cool idea in theory, but once you start actually playing against it and with it, it's clunky, and, you know, it was a big part of the set, and it was just bad. They also didn't have the commander draft aspect, which is the entire thing that makes Commander Legends cool. So that wasn't in there. And then on top of all of these things related to lazy design, overly complicated design, etc., the format was also just bad. Like, you know, at least as bad as Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, and then it gets an extra hit because of the lazy design. But it was another set where aggro was really unbalanced. White had a bunch of absurd cards, most notably at common the 4-mana 2/3 that could attack and give something flying, but it also came with an adventure that could give something indestructibility. And red-white was the best deck in the format. It was just aggressive. You know, they had a mechanic in the set that took away the one downside red-white usually has in, I can't even remember what the mechanic's called, but you would attack with a creature with this mechanic. I'll have it on the screen. And then you would get a copy of that creature in your hand without that keyword. So you like drew cards for attacking, and it just made red-white an incredibly unbalanced, overpowered deck. So it was an ugly set. It was lazily designed. The way they did specialize was horrible in terms of gameplay. And the format was also completely unbalanced, with red, white, and aggro being almost entirely where the format was pointing. So those are my picks for the 5 worst limited formats of the Arena era, plus one sort of honorable mention in the bot draft era Throne of Eldraine for like the first month of its existence. In the comments, let me know if you want to defend any of these sets. You can. If you think there's any horrible sets in the Arena era that I've left out, let me know. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past editions of Nizzanotes, like if you want to hear me talk more about why Capena is bad, there's a bunch of videos that do that. There's also, like I mentioned earlier, the Cold Snap video where I talk about how bad of a format that was. If you want some more negative content, I guess you can go check that out as well. Thanks for watching.